Another day, another real world test. Today we're doing on the Apple iPhone 15 Pro. And I already did a real world test on the Apple iPhone 15 Pro Max. And well, because of how similar these two devices are, there's gonna be some overlap in what we discuss in these videos. But as I said in that video, I will try to put some things in this video that I didn't get time for in the last one, and also vice versa, just have some things that are different in each of them if you want to go check that one out when you're done here. And of course though, we will explore all new places while we test out this phone. But first things first.
Hey, who are you? Coffee. Check.
This is Bird and Branch, a tiny coffee shop started by a husband and wife team, Brandon and Faith Lee, who wanted to give back to the community by creating the cafe. Essentially, they worked with the Hope Organization, a nonprofit, to create a job training program for people with barriers to employment. Some people they employ here, but since it's a small shop, they actually send more of the trainees to find other long-term employment in other coffee shops and restaurants around the city. When they shut down for the pandemic in March of 2020, their team used their little Midtown shop as a hub of operations to assemble and deliver roughly 3,000 breakfasts and care packages to more than 50 hospitals and nursing homes all over New York City. Bird and Branch eventually also began roasting their own coffee, and they work with Bonaventure Coffee to help source it. The couple has stated that their green coffee buying goal is to foster long-term relationships with coffee producers to provide more stability to allow them to invest more in their farms, their produce, and their own families and towns. Gotta love it. While we're here though, let's take a look at the iPhone 15 Pro, which at first glance at least looks a lot like the iPhone 14 Pro. We have the same 6.1-inch screen, which is still a super bright LTPO adaptive display, then go from 120 Hz, or refresh the image on the display 120 times a second to make animations and scrolling look smoother, down to 1 Hz, or 1 time a second when looking at a static image to save power. Looking closer at the display though, we have a tiny bit smaller bezels, and the phone is a tiny bit smaller length and width-wise, but also a tiny bit thicker. And when I say a tiny bit, I mean less than a millimeter in every direction. But the display is also a little curved, so it feels a little less boxy in your hand. I like it. Now, something Apple is pushing about the design is the fact that these side rails are made from titanium now, instead of the usual stainless steel. Titanium is a lighter and more scratch-resistant material, and the weight of the phone is dropped by about 10%, from 206 grams down to 187. It's not a huge deal. I actually feel like you'd notice it more on the Pro Max, since it's also 10% lighter, but it's heavier to begin with, so that's a bit more grams shaved off. But holding the 14 and 15 Pros at the same time, you can definitely tell. For colors, we have black titanium, white titanium, the natural titanium, which is what I got the Pro Max in, and it's probably my favorite color, personally, but that is followed secondly by this color, the blue titanium. Also, we have USB-C. There is no more lightning cable. I'm happy because it means that I am one big step closer to having only one cable in my entire apartment for all of the electronics. Now, of course, Apple didn't do this on their own. They were most likely pressured into it after losing the battle with the European Union over needing to use USB-C. Apple has always made a lot of money off of their ports and their accessories because the port is proprietary. They own the lightning port, and so any company making something with a lightning cable or port had to pay Apple to do so. But this is definitely better for the industry as a whole, as again, most electronics now all have this same port, but it's also not without some issues of its own. Namely, the USB-C is a plug type and not a cable type. This end of the cable is USB Type-C, and this is USB Type-A. And this is technically USB Type-B, which you don't really see anymore, thankfully. Now the cable though, and what it's capable of doing is limited by the USB version that it supports. So 2, 3, 4. But until we get to 4, which is slowly rolling out on devices here and there, there's a ton of confusion for USB 3 specifically. All you need to know is that the Pro models use USB 3.2 Gen 2, which used to be called USB 3.1 Gen 2, and if that isn't confusing enough, it's a generation behind USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2. And then we have USB 4, as mentioned, and Thunderbolt 4, both of which you can take a deep dive in on a decoder episode, my explainer series here on the channel, that I did not too long ago that I'll link below if you want. Regardless, it means top speeds of about 10 gigabits per second. In the real world, that translates to about 1,250 megabytes per second, which is plenty of speed, honestly. But most people with Macs are going to and should use AirDrop anyway. But now, at least for Mac and Windows, you can, thanks to USB here, also just use an external SSD. This means you can plug in an external SSD into your iPhone, and then you can put files on that through the Files app on the iPhone, or even now recording footage directly to it, which is actually Awesome if you're using the phone as a video camera. And then you can plug that into your computer to edit directly off of it, which is what I would do. But we'll talk about the camera in detail in a bit. The other physical change here is we no longer have the silent toggle slider. Instead, we have an action button, which by default does the same thing. And even if you just left it like that, I don't think anyone would miss the slider too much. But the benefit now is that you can set it to basically whatever you want. Focus modes, flashlight, voice memo, which starts recording right away, which is handy. The camera, which is also great because you can then use it to launch the camera, but also tap it as the shutter button. So going from pocket to taking a photo saves a few steps and time, which of course can be key in catching the moment that you want it. But the most powerful thing by far is shortcuts, as you can tap and hold it to open any app or use it to set up a series of actions to happen in a row. Brilliant people on the internet have already set it up for things like ordering themselves a pumpkin spice latte or even unlocking their car and starting the air conditioning or heat. And now we're at Pier 86 at the Intrepid Museum, which is on board the National Historic Landmark, the USS Intrepid. Now, the USS Intrepid was built during World War II in 1943 for the US Navy, and it served tours of duty in World War II and the Vietnam War. The Intrepid was actually decommissioned twice, and after the second time in 1974, it was originally going to be scrapped, but it was eventually decided to save it and turn it into a museum ship. And it's a massive aircraft carrier, by the way. So for those who don't know, an aircraft carrier is basically a floating airport with helipads and a runway where planes can take off and land from. And generally it's used as the capital ship of a fleet, as it allows a naval force to deploy air power worldwide and would usually host the commander of that fleet. This ship, though, now hosts different things. A lot of parties, press conferences, and even wrestling matches since it opened. And it also shut down right after the September 11th attacks, and the FBI used it as an operations center and a helipad. Okay, while we're here, let's talk about the cameras on the new iPhone 15 Pro, because Apple talked a lot about a lot of different things about the cameras, and I think we need to explain it a bit. Firstly, the new 24 megapixel default resolution. So we have our main 48 megapixel sensor with 1.22 micron sized pixels, which is very similar on paper to last year. And as before, the pixels are binned in sets of 4 to get a 12 megapixel image with 2.44 micron sized pixels, which helps with gathering more light, as the larger the pixel, the more light it can receive. But now, during the raw processing pipeline, they also add a 48 megapixel frame and combine that with the usual 12 megapixel binned image to add more data to get a higher res 24 megapixel image while keeping the benefits of the 12 megapixel larger pixel shot. Honestly, it's kind of clever. Now you can go to the settings and change this back down to 12 megapixels, but in my usage, the 24 megapixel shots are just as good. So the only downside is use 4.8 megabytes instead of 3 megabytes. So not double, but a chunk more storage will get used. So just keep that in mind for your iCloud backups, etc. Okay, now Apple came out saying that the new Pro models have the equivalent of 7 different Pro lenses. From the macro to the ultra wide as a 13mm equivalent, then main camera at 24mm equivalent, a 28mm and 35mm equivalents between the main and 2x, aka 48 megapixel equivalent that we gained last year, that crops the middle 12 megapixels from the 48 megapixel sensor to get an optical zoom, similar to using a full frame lens on an APS-C camera in mirrorless camera world. And then either a 3x 77mm equivalent on the Pro, like last year, or a new 5x 120mm equivalent on the new Pro Max. Now, the new focal lengths here are the 5x, the 120mm of the Pro Max, which is now a differentiator between it, and the regular Pro, which still has the 3 times 77mm equivalent length again like last year. And we have 2 new options that you can get by tapping on the main camera. 1.2, which is a 28mm equivalent, and 1.5, which is a 35mm equivalent. Now, unlike the 2x, which is actually cropping the sensor, these aren't doing that, but they are doing a bit more than just digitally cropping. basically they're taking that same 48 megapixel shot that they're using in the processing pipeline, and they're throwing away some of the pixels around that to zoom in a little, then doing all of the usual binning to get better low light and a 12 megapixel image, etc. But with a slightly closer field of view. Now, if you put the images from it versus me just actually digitally cropping the 1x photo, there is more sharpness at least. It's not quite the same as cropping the sensor, which will change the way that the light behaves hitting the sensor, but it's more than just digitally zooming, honestly. If nothing else, it is a nice shortcut to get different framing quickly, which can be handy. Plus, you can even set these as the new default when you open the camera if you want. Now, we also have a new coating over the lenses apparently, but even though a lot of us were kind of hoping that meant it got rid of the iPhone lens flare at night, it hasn't. So, not sure what it actually did, but it's not that, sadly. For photos, we also have a few new software additions as well. We have a 48 megapixel HEIF JPEG option instead of just a 48 megapixel RAW, in case you want higher resolution but you don't need a RAW photo. You can also now switch between these much easier by tapping at the top right, instead of diving into the camera settings within the settings like before. Now, these options did actually come to my iPhone 14 Pro Max when I updated it to iOS 17, by the way, just so you know. But we also have a cool new way now to do portrait mode. Firstly, you don't need to select portrait mode. Instead, as soon as it recognizes a human, dog, or cat, it will give you a small F icon, the symbol for aperture, which is what you use to control the bokeh or background blur of an image, by the way, and you can then tap that to get portrait mode up. But they even took that a step further, and even if you don't tap the F, it will automatically grab depth data, and so you can decide after if you want to make it a portrait mode shot, but also how much blur you want, and even change what to focus on. Now, if that seems familiar to you, yes, it is a feature that has been on Android phones for a long time. But it is nice to see it here on an iPhone, and I have to say that the bokeh roll-off is actually pretty good most of the time, and obviously a lot more natural than it was back then. Now, if you do want to use this on a non-human dog or cat photo, you can choose portrait mode like normal, and you'll get the ability to change focus and depth after the fact for that too. You can also now do night mode portrait as well, which is just a nice addition. And apparently they've adjusted the HDR to be a bit more natural, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that, as well as what you think of the difference in the photos as always, with the comparisons throughout this video. You might have seen this odd structure before. This is the Vessel. It was built as the focus of the 5-acre Hudson Yards public square here in Midtown Manhattan. It's 16 stories high with almost 2,500 individual steps, 154 interconnecting flights of stairs, and 80 landings, and it's made up of a reflective copper-colored steel. The intricate design was modeled after Indian stepwells, which were multi-storied stairwells used in India to get down to the water. The reason there are so many different levels is because the water levels varied seasonally, and were much, much lower during a drought. The structure is made up of 87 carbon steel pieces that were made in a plant in Monfalcone, Italy, and brought to the US by ship in 6 separate shipments. They ported in Newark, which is in New Jersey just across the river, and the sections of the sculpture were loaded onto barges to be pushed up the Hudson River to the Hudson River docks. From the dock, they were driven at night to the Hudson Yards construction site, and then put together almost like puzzle pieces to form what it looks like now. The name Vessel was actually supposed to be the temporary name to use while it was being built, and then the public would have decided a name collectively after that, but it just kind of stuck. But that didn't stop the public from giving it many nicknames, including the Beehive, Waste Paper Basket, Drinking Glass, Shawarma, and Pineapple Thing, to name a few. Okay, back to the iPhone 15 Pro. The biggest change to the video camera here that I know videographers are excited about is the ability to shoot in LAW. But since we already discussed it at length in the iPhone 15 Pro Max video, and it's not a feature most people will ever use if we're honest, even if it is interesting, I'll just link that video below for those wanting to learn more about some of the things like log that I show there, and feel like I should maybe skip here in favor of some of the things that I mentioned I didn't get a chance to discuss in that video. Okay, firstly, of those things, gaming has got some interesting changes. In the iPhone 15 Pro and the iPhone 15 Pro Max, Apple has their new chipset, the A17 Pro, which, for the first time, has a new Pro moniker like the M-series chipsets do, and is apparently a bigger jump up from the A16 Bionic inside the iPhone 15 and iPhone 15 Plus. Now, as with most things you'll do on the phone, you probably won't notice any sort of difference in daily usage. But Apple is touting the new A17 Pro as having the, quote, biggest redesign in the history of Apple GPUs, end quote, and showed off some AAA games running on the new iPhone Pro models. Now we have hardware-accelerated ray tracing, which makes light and reflections look a lot better in games, as well as Metal FX upscaling, which was previously only available on Macs. All of which means that this early version of Resident Evil Village I've been playing for a little bit now looks and runs like the real console version. You can also use various USB-C gaming controllers like these, which I'll link below if you want to check those out, as well as your usual Bluetooth gaming controllers too. It's honestly pretty impressive. But the more interesting thing to me here is the fact that this is what could get Apple's gaming ecosystem going a bit more, which has always been lacking a bit behind PC, and this could give some fuel to maybe start catching up. Essentially, Apple's been releasing plenty of tools to help developers port games over to Apple Silicon. But as we know, developers don't want to go through the trouble of porting their game over, or app for that matter, to other operating systems. It usually comes down to their time and resources versus the potential number of new installs they would get, and most game developers just haven't really seen Mac as that big of an opportunity yet. That is getting easier and easier with new tools from Apple, but now, with the same set of APIs and game-centric features that they have on Mac as well, now coming to the iPhone itself. Okay, so imagine this. You're a game developer with a game like, I don't know, Resident Evil 4 that kind of ran its course already on console years ago when it was released on GameCube in 2005. And now you have the opportunity to then release it again on iPhone without having to do too much thanks to those tools, and even charge for it again. And now you have that huge number of iPhone users across the world as a potential new customer base. Starts to feel a bit more worth the effort. Right? Apple is being clever though here too, in that once games come to the iPhone like this, they're automatically able to run on every other Apple Silicon device, from iPads
To Macs, because of how it all works now.
And if the way this game plays on here is any indication, well, it's going to be very interesting to watch how gaming on Apple devices in general goes over the next few years. Another hardware feature here on the Pro models only that's related in a way to gaming that I think is great, frankly, is Wi-Fi 6E. Wi-Fi 6E is important if you have 1 gigabit per second speeds or higher in your house to be able to consistently receive those speeds over Wi-Fi. Now, I did a full decoder episode, my explainer series here on the channel on what Wi-Fi 6E is, that I'll link below for those curious for a deeper dive into that. Okay, firstly, here is my screen on time and my usage for today, for anyone who's curious about that. But just keep in mind that this is not a normal day. I use the camera way more than you ever would. But here is another day that was a much more normal day that you can check out how it did then to have something much more normal to compare it to. Honestly, the battery of the iPhone 15 Pro feels better than the iPhone 14 Pro, and since that was pretty decent to me, that's definitely a win. Now, something else that's a win is that apparently because of the new iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max's design, they are also cheaper to repair. Something that my buddy Tom, the tech chef, pointed out not too long ago. But there you go. Let me know what you guys thought of the Apple iPhone 15 Pro. Also, what you thought of this video, my weird little format that I do. Always appreciate hearing from you guys and appreciate the feedback. Now, if you didn't go watch the Apple iPhone 15 Pro Max real-world test that I did before this, I'll leave a link below to that. If you want to go check that out, we explore different places, and there's a little bit of information in that that is not in this, if you're curious. As always, I will leave the best price that I could on the iPhone 15 Pro in the description below. If you're not subscribed already, please do so. Ding the bell. Get notified when I do new videos and we explore new places with new tech. But it has been a long day of filming, as always, and a lot of frustrations with sounds. as always. And I'm exhausted, so going to bed. Good night.
Wait for it.
Bye. Here it comes. Big old truck, little street, ready to go. Terrible beer, just saying. Why? It's like a squeaky sound. In a helicopter. Plane, something. Looks a lot like the iPhone 14 Pro truck. Hammer, somebody banging a hammer. Is it a bit more on the Pro Max? Why are these people so loud? Old man screams at cloud. That is me now with sounds. Swishy pants, swishy pants. Swishy coat. Get a coat. That's a little better. Truck? Is it a truck? It is. It's a truck. Yay, truck. Again, why? Why do people do that? Why do they want everyone else to hear their music? Headphones. They exist. They're cheap. Crinkling his bag. Play with the bag. Yep. What is it? Chips? Salsa? Chips and salsa? That's good. Delicious. Already set it up for things like, stop yelling. Just stop yelling. You're right next to each other. You don't need to yell. Just talk. Normal volume. Sweet helipod. Helicopter incoming. I hear him. There he is. I forgot the Hudson River has now become basically a path for helicopters. Yeah, there he is. 4.8 megapixels. Here he comes. He's so loud. There he is. If nothing else, there's a helicopter, as always. Oh my god. Helicopter, again. Just a bit. Helicopter. Click, click, click. There's so many cars on this road. It's a tiny little side street. It looks like it leads to a parking garage. It's that kind of a vibe. But just so many cars. Look at them. Look at them all. Maybe they're all going to a parking garage. That is also possible. And these squeaky brakes, bro. Everybody gotta get your brakes fixed. Public service announcement. And this. Those are some good squeaky brakes. Really neglected those ones you did. It's a never-ending stream of cars. I really want to know what's at the end of the street now. Something real popular. Whatever it is. Taxi driver just stopped to give me the thumbs up. It's nice. But, since we already discussed... But something just exploded. Sound like bottles. Cool. Jet engine. Some sort of jet plane. Probably taken off from the carrier earlier. Just flying across Manhattan to annoy me.